On a scorching June morning in the year 1899, in the vast and unforgiving plains of eastern Texas, a simple, routine visit by a concerned neighbor would unravel a horror so profound that it would leave an entire community shaken for generations. A tragedy so deeply disturbing that even decades later, whispers of that summer would still echo through the quiet winds of Cedar Creek, carrying with them the memory of a mother who, in the depths of her unraveling mind, committed an act so unimaginable that it blurred the line between love and madness forever. The Yates farmstead stood alone against the endless stretch of land, a modest wooden house surrounded by acres of wheat fields that swayed gently under the relentless Texas sun, giving the illusion of peace and prosperity. Yet behind its walls, a silent storm had been building for months, unseen, unheard, and tragically misunderstood by those who believed they knew the family well. Margaret Yates had once been admired by everyone in Cedar Creek, a woman spoken of with admiration and quiet envy, a devoted wife and a nurturing mother who seemed to embody everything a frontier woman was expected to be: strong, patient, graceful under pressure, and unwavering in her dedication to her family. But beneath that carefully maintained image, something fragile had begun to fracture, slowly at first, like a hairline crack in glass, then spreading wider with each passing day until it threatened to shatter her entirely. She had not been born into hardship. Margaret had grown up in a relatively comfortable home in Austin, raised in an environment of stability and order where her days were filled with education, quiet routines, and the gentle expectations of a middle-class upbringing, a life that had done little to prepare her for the brutal, isolating realities of frontier existence, where survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on a mental resilience that few truly understood until it was tested beyond its limits.
When she married Thomas Yates, a hard-working German immigrant determined to carve out a future for himself on the American frontier, it seemed like the beginning of a hopeful new chapter, a union that promised stability, growth, and the fulfillment of dreams rooted in land ownership and family. Yet the reality of that life proved far harsher than anything Margaret could have imagined. The farm demanded everything: endless labor, constant attention, and a level of endurance that left little room for rest or reflection. And as the years passed, Margaret found herself trapped in a relentless cycle of responsibilities, caring for child after child, managing the household, tending to daily chores, and maintaining the appearance of perfection that society demanded, all while her husband spent long periods away trying to keep their farm financially afloat. 5 children in rapid succession brought not only joy, but an overwhelming weight of responsibility. And while Margaret loved them deeply, their constant needs began to consume every part of her existence, leaving her exhausted, isolated, and increasingly detached from the world beyond her front door, her once vibrant personality fading into something quieter, something strained, something that those around her noticed but failed to truly understand. Neighbors began to whisper about the changes, how Margaret no longer laughed as she once did, how her smiles seemed forced, how her conversations grew shorter and more distant. But in a time when mental suffering was often dismissed as mere weakness or temporary exhaustion, these warning signs were brushed aside, explained away with simple assumptions that she would recover on her own. As the months passed, Margaret's isolation deepened, the distance between her and the outside world growing wider with each passing day, especially during the long stretches when Thomas was away, leaving her alone with 5 young children and no one to share the burden of her responsibilities or the growing chaos within her mind. What began as exhaustion slowly transformed into something far more dangerous, a creeping sense of despair that settled into her thoughts and refused to leave, whispering doubts, fears, and eventually voices that she could no longer distinguish from reality, voices that spoke to her in the quiet hours of the night, filling her mind with terrifying visions of the future, visions in which her children suffered in ways she could not bear to imagine.
At first, she tried to ignore them, convincing herself that they were nothing more than the product of fatigue. But as time went on, those voices grew louder, more persistent, more convincing, until they became impossible to silence, weaving themselves into her thoughts and shaping her perception of the world around her. The medicine prescribed to calm her nerves, a common opium-based remedy of the time, offered only temporary relief, dulling her senses, but also blurring the boundaries between reality and hallucination. And as her dependence on it grew, so too did the intensity of the visions that haunted her, creating a cycle from which she could not escape. Despite the growing severity of her condition, those around her continued to underestimate the danger. Her husband dismissing concerns as overreaction, neighbors hesitating to interfere in what they believed to be private family matters, and the local doctor lacking the understanding necessary to recognize the true nature of her illness. By the time Margaret began speaking openly about her fears, about the terrible fate she believed awaited her children, it was already too late. Her mind having crossed a threshold from which it could not return, her perception of reality so distorted that what she saw as protection, others would soon recognize as destruction. On the morning her husband left for what would be his final journey away from home, Margaret stood in the doorway holding her youngest child, watching as he disappeared down the dusty road, unaware that in those final moments he was leaving behind not only his family, but the last fragile thread holding together the remnants of her sanity. The house grew quiet after his departure, a silence that felt heavier than usual, pressing against her thoughts, amplifying the voices that now spoke to her with frightening clarity, telling her that time was running out, that danger was near, that only she had the power to prevent the suffering that awaited her children.
What followed was not an act of rage or cruelty, but a methodical, deliberate decision shaped by a mind that believed it was acting out of love, a tragic misunderstanding of reality in which Margaret convinced herself that the only way to save her children was to spare them from a future she had come to fear more than death itself. She prepared their final meal with care, ensuring that everything appeared normal, even comforting, as she mixed the fatal doses into their food, her hands steady, her expression calm, as if she were simply fulfilling her duties as a mother, unaware that she was crossing a line from which there could be no return. One by one, the children grew drowsy, their voices fading, their movements slowing, until the house fell into an unnatural stillness, a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb even the sound of her own breathing, leaving her alone with the consequences of what she had done. When the neighbors finally arrived, drawn by an unshakable sense that something was wrong, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 5 children lying peacefully in their beds as if asleep, their stillness masking the horror of their fate, and a mother sitting calmly nearby, believing she had fulfilled her duty. Margaret showed no resistance, no panic, no remorse, only a quiet certainty that she had done what was necessary, that she had saved her children from a fate far worse than death, a belief that she would carry with her for the rest of her life.
The community was left in shock, grappling with the realization that the signs had been there all along, that the tragedy might have been prevented if only someone had truly listened, truly understood, truly acted before it was too late. Margaret was declared mentally unfit and sent to an asylum, where she would spend her remaining years lost in a reality of her own making, still believing that her children were safe, still unaware of the true nature of her actions, while her husband, unable to bear the weight of his loss, disappeared from the life he had once worked so hard to build. The story of the Yates family became a haunting reminder of the dangers of isolation, the consequences of ignoring mental illness, and the fragile line between love and destruction, a tragedy not born from evil, but from a failure to understand the depths of human suffering. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that Margaret Yates was not alone in her struggle, that in the quiet, isolated corners of the world there may have been others just like her, unheard, unseen, and left to face their darkness alone until it consumed them completely.